Three, two, one.
Recording in progress.
Hello, and welcome to the AI Today podcast. I'm your host, Kathleen WALCH.
And I'm your host, Ronald Schmelzer. And, really wanted to thank all of you for being our podcast listeners. It's now going well over 5 years. It's actually hard to count all the podcast episodes. We're going to be hitting 300 fairly soon. And for many people, that's a lot. But for other people who have been podcasting for a while, hey, 5 years is nothing. Some people have been podcasting for 10 or even 15 years. So, we got a long ways to go. And I think the great thing about AI today is we never really run out of topics to talk about. As a matter of fact, just by way of preview, we are in the midst of recording a pretty substantial podcast series on glossary terms because there's so many terms and terminology around AI and machine learning and all the concepts. And sometimes we use these terms we don't always see eye to eye on what they mean. And so we're like, let's just put together a glossary. So just a little bit of a preview. You'll be seeing a lot of episodes on that, and they will be fairly short and concise, but focused on that. So I just really wanted to bring that to your attention. But we're also bringing another thing back here for AI Today, which we haven't done in a little while, which is there are other great podcast hosts that are talking about topics that are very symbiotic and really overlap well with our audience, which is focused on making AI a reality today. And we are thrilled to be bringing back our podcast swaps and having a guest join with us today who's focused around project management and has some really unique perspectives around project management and especially around Agile. And because we've been talking about these concepts a lot and embedding that increasingly into the CPMI methodology, doing more and more with Agile, we think this is a really good opportunity for us to bring that in.
Exactly. And so that's why we wanted to start these podcast swaps again, because it's one thing to hear it from us, but it's another thing to hear it from, project management, Agile, Scrum experts. So we're really excited to have with us here today Greg Mester, who's the host of the 5 a.m. Mester Scrum podcast. So welcome, Greg, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm all excited about talking about AI today and artificial intelligence. This is awesome.
Yeah, we are too. We'd love to start by having you introduce yourself to our listeners, tell them a little bit about your background, why you started your podcast, and maybe what it's all about.
Just from a background perspective, started as an engineer, went through the tech side, worked with DoD in the past, built, I guess you can say, tanks. And you'd be amazed that I applied an agile methodology to building tanks when I did that with the Army, and the technology and the electronics and the hardware. And people say, how do you do it? Well, I realized I was just getting my teams to share information, demoing it to the customer. And because we were the only one demoing anything, we kept getting the contracts. So it was classic Agile. And then I learned about it and got a cert. What is this? I was in California at the time, in the Bay Area, right? Silicon Valley. And I'm like, what's this Agile stuff? Because this is something. And I realized it just clicked. And this is what I do and how I've been doing it my whole career as a program project manager, engineer. And it just became that. And then later on, as I'm doing the Scrum and the Agile, everyone says, you really know this stuff and you really kind of live it. Can you teach everyone else? So it became more of a teaching, showing, demonstrating. And then later on with the podcast, I just got to a point where I learned so much from so many different teams and thousands of daily scrums. Like I calculate one time, I think I did 3,500 daily scrums so far, and I was like, okay, I think I've seen a few, and just started sharing in the podcast. And one of the things in IT and tech, everyone's talking about social media. I was like, what the heck? Give it a shot. That's all part of experiment, right? You can fail, you can start, you never know. And I've learned just like in the social media podcast world, if you're not putting stuff out every day, the technology changes every day. You won't know. Like if you wait a week, it could be different tomorrow. You try to do your setup and you have to start all over and oh my God, nothing's working. So that's how my podcast started. And I was just telling a story earlier. It was like my son one day just doing videos. He went viral. We just put a little thing with a Coke Mentos experiment and he went viral. Next thing I know, hey, you got 13 million views in YouTube, and it just goes that way. So it's just a great way of sharing in the podcast world too.
Yeah, and you know what it's like? We've been producing podcasts on a weekly basis, but you've been producing them on a daily basis. So you're like 880 some episodes, I think was the current count. So that's it's pretty impressive. You know, there's something to be said about consistency, which I know is part of actually doing some of these methodologies, like doing and repeating and testing and all that sort of stuff is part of this agile concept and the philosophy, especially behind it. But of course, there's the specifics behind actually making agile work. And I think maybe for the purposes of our audience is fairly diverse. I mean, we have a worldwide audience. They're doing AI at many different levels. Some are very involved and very technical and very much involved in day-to-day AI projects. And many folks are actually fairly new, just getting started. Even some folks maybe still going through school, trying to learn it. Maybe people who have a data science or a machine learning background, some who have a business background and a more of a planning and a structure. And so I think there maybe for the purposes of our audience, we can explain a little bit about some of the terminology you're using, especially around Agile and Scrum and some of these things, and give some of an understanding as to kind of what we're talking about here and how that might sort of differentiate from what people might be doing today.
Yeah, and I did do some research. I listened to some of your podcasts. They were really good, by the way. And when you talked about doing Agile, or we are Agile, these people that said, oh, we're doing Agile, and you ask questions. And I'm like, I'm the same way. I'm like, let me see what you're doing. You're telling me you're doing Agile. Is it really Agile? Is it just Jira? Right? So that's great. So maybe we'll have that interaction. When they say we're going to introduce Agile to run our AI projects, maybe we can have a conversation about that too.
Yeah, so I think maybe that's a good place to start. With this question, which is, where do you think companies or teams fail? When they're saying we are doing Agile, and maybe as I mentioned, for our audience, maybe let's get into some definitions here about what Agile is, kind of where is Agile today, maybe the concept of Scrum that people may not even be familiar with that.
Yeah, we can do that too. And as far as the Agile, and then you have the waterfall, right? You have Agile and you have waterfall as two different quote methodologies out there. I never thought of waterfall as a methodology until I met the Scrum world. I'm like, oh, okay, we got to call it something. I just thought it was project management, to be honest with you, and it had a Gantt chart. And that's where the waterfall looks like a waterfall. The Gantt chart looks like a waterfall. But with the Agile, there is the Agile Manifesto, which is some values that everyone holds dear, and then there's 4 of them, and then there's like another 12 or other ones that go along with the 4 key ones. And then there's different frameworks, whether it be Scrum, XP, SAFe, Kanban, other ones that I think you have referenced in some of your podcasts too, that are out there that are just different ways of framing up how you want to interact with other people. And I think people confuse how you framing up the interaction to what Agile is and shaping that conversation. And I think that's where they get that mistake. And the big thing people, they get to hire somebody that says, okay, we're going to make user stories. So we're going to build this database, and it could be in a spreadsheet. It could be in some product out there where they list all their stories. Just because you list all your stories doesn't mean you're Agile. And Agile is about interacting with people. It's about working with the customer, being flexible with things that change. And AI is a change agent, right? It's a new thing. So you have to, if you really are Agile, you're going to free up space to bring that change into what you're doing. And I think that's where a lot of these activities arise.
It's interesting because I think that some of the things that you hear as well, but you're even more in that project management world. So when people are, talking about Agile, they say that we're doing Agile. And also, I think sometimes it's like, we want to be Agile. So if I say it enough, then we will be, but it's not really. But it's like, if I say it enough, then we will be. So what have you seen, people commonly misunderstand about Agile, especially technologists?
And in the Agile world, they think that it's about, they think we don't demo to the customer as much, or it'll take us forever to get it perfect to get in front of the customer. In the real Agile world, it's not about perfection. It's about feedback loops. lots of feedback loops so that you can adjust what you're delivering. Because how many times, whether it be in waterfall or in Agile, you have customers saying, well, I'll know it when I see it, and then I'll tell you what I want. And if you don't get it in front of the customer, they'll never give you that feedback loop, and you could be going some path that does not work for anyone. No matter what your methodology is, it doesn't matter. It's going to fail. So getting that feedback loop, but it's just one of those things from a technology, like they have to know everything, but in the way of the Agile thinking is you're not going to know everything. We admit it that we're not going to know it, and we just deal with it, right? But we also put it small enough that, yes, we don't know. I'm not going to give you 6 months to figure out what we don't know, but I want you to share with your teammates what you did learn. And a real Agile organization, it's not just about sharing with the customer. And I coach so many teams this way. It's like, well, we just do code or we do something and it's internal and it's not necessarily with the customer. I'm like, well, then demo to your coworkers, your teammates. I've been in companies where they would, I won't use the names, but they would show some stuff and it would just process 30 million records and like snap out. And everyone's looking at code. Oh, I want that code. Can I use that code? And it's where you get people in your group building up on what somebody else did. And that's what real Agile is. And that's where the technologists may not understand. It's also about sharing with your teammates and growing what you came up with and you building off of what they came up with, right? You're going to see something they came up with and you're going to, oh, let me do that. Let me use that in the next thing. And I think that's where the technologists don't understand the real Agile. And even Agile people don't get that sometimes, what that really is. It's about working with others.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think, honestly, really project management is for people. I mean, even though we may be dealing with products and technology and things like that, it's really all about, managing finite resources, people's time, money, budgets, schedule, physical resources, right? And I think that's kind of where we started. We actually used a couple of terms here that I think might be worthwhile to kind of dig into, because one of the things we mentioned was this idea of waterfall. We brought it up. We have brought it up in our previous, projects where it's like podcasts where we talk about the fact that, if you're thinking about a big project, especially a really big one that involves, a lot of resources and a lot of people, and maybe something that's like very physical, like you're building, the Saturn V rocket,
right?
You're building like, a shopping mall. There are a bunch of things you need to think of advance, not just the building part, but the permits and the utilities, and then the cleaning, and then the, everything from like the inside and the outside, the landscaping and the fire. And so it's a lot of things to think about. It's a lot of people involved. There's a lot of resources. You don't want to mess things up and like be halfway through your project and realize, oh, we didn't allocate space for parking or something. That's kind of a bad thing to forget. And then you have to go back. There's traditional, the old style project managers to kind of think of all the things you need to do in advance, right? Plan for that, then you allocate for that, then you go ahead and you do all those things, and then you implement. And that's sort of why it's that waterfall idea, right? But I think, I don't know, you want to talk to waterfall at all? Or?
Well, yeah, and like I said, I realized I was doing all my waterfall projects in a very Agile way because, yes, there are states, but I'll give you an example. I had some system engineers doing we were writing software and thing that didn't exist. And they were like, well, I got 6 months. I'm like, no. I want you to write the requirements document and share it with your software guy, the team, and have them try to make sure we can create what you just wrote as a requirement. And I want the testing people to get an idea what's coming along so they can start planning at the same time. So rather than the waterfall, hey, this group does everything first, then this person gets it, and then this group gets it. That's how you expand these projects that are endless. What I did is crush it in and make virtual Agile teams because they're communicating with what they're going every week. They would develop another section of the requirement that would get handed off, and they would all see it at the same time and give these quick feedback loops. What you asked for, we can't build yet. We didn't wait a year or 6 months to figure out we can't build it. It was within that month. And that's how that's the big difference with those waterfalls, where in the waterfall, it's only this group, and then they hand it to the next group, and then the next group. And I think from an Agile, you just obliterate that whole concept of one team then another. And that's also a danger in the Agile word. Where I'll be honest with you, these companies say they're Agile, they created these little waterfall teams. I call it Scrumafall, where they would have one Scrum team do one thing, hand it off to another Scrum team in the next 2 weeks, and then they would hand that to another Scrum team 2 weeks later. Next thing you know, something that should take a couple days to get done now just took 2 months, right? Because maybe they only had one little piece of code, and I call that Scrumafall. So that's where you see those groups. We're Agile, of course you are, but you're not working as a team. You're working as separate entities and just extending those deadlines. And no wonder why you can never meet a deadline, right? And these are the kind of things that come into it.
Yeah, and I know we have a question about Scrum coming up in a few, but
Okay.
maybe since we're at definitions, can you give your definition of Scrum?
I actually think of Scrum as some developer developed what they do in their process of developing code and created up these events and activities. So Scrum is basically 5 events. There is a Scrum guide out there that's free. Anybody can get it and read it and look at it. And I like to look at it a couple things. One, there's 3 roles and then 5 events related to Scrum, and there's values associated with that, but we don't need to go into that. That'd be a longer conversation. And why I have so many podcasts. There's so many derivations of what you can come out with these guides. So the 3 roles are the product owner, which is supposed to be the connection to the business, the customer, right? That's what the product owner writes what down and prioritize what the customer wants so that the team doesn't have to do it. There's a dev team, development team, which I kind of disagree with the Scrum guide, and they can always come. I like to call them creators. I think they're all creators, whether it be a product owner, the dev team, or even the Scrum Master, just creators. Because they're all creating something. And then you have you have the Scrum Master. Scrum Master is in charge of making sure everyone understands Scrum, the process, the help to look at and keep the flow going as far as the work goes. So those are the 3 roles, and the dev team builds the product. The 5 events. One is the sprint, which is like an iteration, right? Usually 2 weeks to a month. It could be a day, it could be a week, it could be up to a month on that iteration. And in that iteration, you do a couple things. One, you prioritize what you want to do, called the sprint planning session. So these are the things we want to do in this 2-week or 1-week iteration. And that's just like you are a developer. What am I going to do? What do I want to work on? And you just give yourself a calendar, which I love. First, the project manager's end list. This is, I have 2 weeks and I get report. We see what things happen. And then you have a daily Scrum, which when I was working on F/A/T/E/N/F for the Navy Department, first flight, we had daily stand-ups every day, 5 of us. Just talk about different things from the engine, the electronics to the airframe, where were the testers. We did this every day, with or without. So it's a normal thing for a team just to see what we got going on and make sure we don't have any clashes and make sure everyone knows what's going on. And then we had part of it is a sprint review, is another part where you're demoing what you produce. And I kind of talked about that earlier, where if you're a technologist, you should be demoing to your partners on your team what you came up with so that we can all learn. And what that does is it accelerates the growth pattern. Okay. If it's just you're not accelerating. But if you share what you did with 5 other people or 10 other, you're 10xing, if you ever listen to Grant Cardone, 10xing what you're producing, because now you got 10 people doing your stuff. And then the last one is a retrospective. And the retrospective is where everyone meets and what did we do? What worked? What didn't work? There's lots of ways of doing it. And this is also a thing where a lot of teams will stop doing the retrospective because they're not getting the benefit of it. And that's one of the things that kills a lot of Agile teams. The whole idea behind the retrospective, what can we do in the very next sprint that we can improve what we did in this past one? What did we learn? What can we do better? And that, again, gets the growth pattern up. And if you do this right, I've had teams that would double their work output in 6 months. I mean, where they were and then where do they go, because they're actually iterating every time. And that's, to me, Scrum in a nutshell.
Well, that's just that's what people are looking for, right? That when people think Agile, I think they're thinking about the characteristics of Agile. Maybe they're not necessarily thinking about the specifics of the process. They may not be thinking the specifics about the kinds of all the stuff you mentioned, the teams and the outputs and the actions and all sorts of stuff. They may not necessarily be thinking about that, but they're thinking about that desired end state, which is, we actually referred to that in our training as something we call the digital transformation log jam, which is like there's this desire to take advantage of all these great technologies, these great digital technologies, because it'll make things more efficient, make things more productive, reduce bottlenecks, improve communication, all that sort of stuff. But we run into these log jams all the time because we're running into processes that are human bound, that are document bound, that it would require a rethinking of the way things are done, which is actually much harder to do than to buy. People like to buy the technology and like say, okay, we bought it. It's like, well, it's much easier to do that than to just change the way you do invoicing or change the way you do, some customer process, right? And I think people want that desired end state. They want to think that they're flexible and agile. It's kind of interesting you bring up tanks, because actually tanks is making the news a lot these days.
Yeah.
People thought the era of tank warfare was over. It's like, well, guess again. Or maybe it is, maybe not. Like, the reality is changing, right? But we have these tanks coming onto the battlefield that were built in like the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah. Yes.
In some cases, it's just a little crazy, right? You think about the process that went into designing them and all the things they had to think about. Where will this tank be used, and what will the environment be like, and what will the adversaries be like? A lot of those assumptions have fundamentally changed, but it takes so long to put these things into practice that you can't be thinking in terms of the software world likes to think, when you think about a year is forever in software land, right?
Well, yeah, and I'll be honest with you, my philosophy when I work with the military is I have young men and women out there, and I want to get stuff in their hands. I want to do the best I can in their hands, doing what they versus long drawn out, and those are the kind of thing, very agile, right? You want to get it in the hands, help them do their job, because they got enough. They got bullets flying around. They don't need to mess around. They just want the stuff, and whatever they can get them, I get them. And that was my philosophy. Why the agile part came in really well.
Yeah, this was great. And thank you for kind of defining some of those roles. We now have a new term that I've never heard before, Scrumafall. We say WAGile a lot, which is like a waterfall agile combination.
Well, yeah, and there's a little different, and the Wagafall is where they actually go in a sprint, an iteration, and do waterfall. So they'll get a designer in the sprint, like they have 2 weeks. Designer will code, and then a BA will do something, and then a developer, and then a tester, and they do this in this waterfall inside a little 2 week boundary, and it's why nothing gets done until the last day of the sprint. Where the Scrumafall is sprint after sprint after sprint. It's just on steroids.
Yeah, and earlier how I was saying that there was sometimes teams want to be agile, and so they say they're agile, but they're actually not. And I think that's where WAGile comes into play, where they want to be, but they're not. And so problems can arise because of that. Especially, I mean, we've been talking about technology, right? Ron said a year in the technology world is a tremendous amount of time, where a year, maybe if you're, building an airplane or building a tank or building a shopping mall, it's not that far, it's not considered as long. Maybe not as much is going to change within that year. So when you're taking a really long time on AI projects, it can have tremendous impacts, and not all of them are positive impacts. It can be negative. Technology is changing, things are changing, data's changing. So specifically for data scientists and AI developers that listen to our podcast and are, in our community, what should data scientists and AI developers know about Agile?
Don't listen to what I call the Agile accountants that tell you it's all about velocity and counting metrics and all that. And the worst one is utilization. The utilization is the death nail for any good AI project or anything like that, to be honest with you. Because in your mind, and when you really dive into this stuff as a real coach or a real Scrum Master, you want to free up time for them to think. and process what they want to do before they start building something, right? So if you're trying to do 100% utilization, you're not giving your team time to think and figure it out. And then the other thing is, don't overthink about it. It's not a time card system like when they do it, right? The Agile, they do it. It's not a time card. Don't think of how many hours think about the complexity of what you're trying to solve. And how do we make it less complex to make it in a sprint or an iteration for something that's going to take months of time to do. And those are the kind of things, as a technologist, don't overthink it. Don't figure out how many hours. Don't try that. And I like doing, when I do estimates and stuff like that, some people are like non-estimates, but we do it like in 30 seconds. We as a group, and you're getting multiple people, even though they're not doing your specific job, but they understand what you're doing. They're smart people. They got a lot of gray matter up there. I worked with PhDs from Georgia Tech years ago, and I'm like, they asked me, what should we do? I'm like, I'm not going to tell you, you're the PhD. I'm just a project manager. If I'm telling you, I don't need to hire you. I'm going to tell you that right now. If I had to tell you what to do, that I don't need you. And they created stuff in like 6 months, and we had, because of that philosophy, where they thought about it and figured out where they were going to go at the same time they're developing, we developed stuff where my competition was commenting back to me and said, you're the only group that actually delivered something. And we did it in 6 months, and we were fielding it. I mean, we went from nothing, the hardware. We built the electronics, the boards, the breadboard, the software, everything. And actually had a little bit of AI in it, early version, because they would actually talk, these devices would talk to each other. It was like this is 1990s. And they would just start communicating, figure the best path to go to broadcast the information that was what they had in it. So those are the kind of things that you want to have some space to talk, space to interact with your coworkers, right? Share your learnings. And that's so key with being Agile.
Yeah, for sure. Being retrospective and really thinking about things before you do them is a necessity, but it often feels like a luxury, especially when you have a lot of stuff going on. Like, I don't have time to think about it, but sometimes actually thinking about it is probably the best use of your time. I know Kathleen and I spend a lot of time being retrospective, maybe too much time thinking about what needs to be done, but it really works out for us. Yeah.
Well, that could be a detriment too, and which is the beauty of the sprint iteration. It makes you say, okay, I thought about this enough. Mike Cohen would say, knowing 60% is good enough. Go, move on. Don't try to overthink it, right? And that's why I love this iteration. It forces you not to overthink something and move on and try something out, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, exactly. And, actually kind of to that point, in terms of about AI, and actually that's like the bread and butter. We've been spending the last 5 years talking about AI nonstop. And of course, we're going to talk about AI today because this is the AI Today podcast. So
of course,
we're not going to not talk about AI. So let's actually bring in a little bit of AI. And part of the reason why we talk about project management in the context of AI is that a lot of the reasons for AI project failures, and there are many, that's one of the biggest things that we've been talking about, especially this past year or so, is that a very high percentage of AI projects are not being completed successfully. And by successfully, we mean that they are not achieving whatever the outcome is that they were supposed to achieve. And therefore, the project is just getting canceled, or they're just, not continuing, and there's many examples of this. And it turns out there's roughly about 10 or so main reasons why these AI projects fail. And of course, we have a podcast series on it. So for our AI Today podcast listeners, you can listen to our AI failure series, and we talk a lot about it. Those have been actually one of our most popular series. People kind of know what AI is good for. They just don't know why it's not working for them. And they will tell you, hey, it's not working for you for the same reasons why it's not working for so many others. And a lot of it does come down to these issues of managing scope, the right solution to the right problem, issues of over-promising and under-delivering, so many issues, of course, data quantity and data quality, a unique problem perhaps to AI projects in some ways. But, I think, when we think about how project, bringing in real solid project management expertise and knowing how to address some of these problems so that you have people who are not great technologists, but don't really know how to really scope and manage and run that project well. And you may be surprising, but we've talked to many C-levels, people with the chief technology officer, chief data officer, chief AI officer, chief information officer roles, and we ask them straight up. We say, okay, great. What methodologies, what processes and practices are you using for these AI projects that you're spending millions of dollars on? And they come back, they go, methodology? What's that?
Yeah.
Literally, sometimes it's very sad, very scary. So, maybe you could think about, the question is like, one, how you think bringing in some of these practices that have been around for decades, hundreds of years, right, for project management into AI. And then on the flip side, how AI can itself help application and agile teams.
Yeah. You mentioned a bunch of things there. And I'll just go from the documentation, the methodology, and what I read on your stuff is more lessons learned, how to really run this project, and what goes some detailed technical questions, like even from an architecture perspective and all that. And I ask the same question sometimes. Agile does not provide you how to do it. Agile, most of the frameworks give you a framework of how to communicate with each other in a team, and I think that's a misnomer. Right? It's not going to give you the technical solution. Where the team should be developing. I'm really surprised. A lot of places they don't have the software or the coding or the old engineering school. It's like, did you want to, like they all want engineering grads. I'm like, you're not even practice what you got taught in engineering school about laying down this methodology. How do you want to solve this and documenting as you go? And that goes to also the reviewing, the sprint review, right? Where you're not only you're doing it, but you're sharing with your coworkers so they all learn from how you came up with the skill. And maybe one of the subtasks is to document up a wiki page or put something or wherever you have it so people can grab from that. But then sharing with your coworkers where that information is. And I totally agree with you on that methodology. They just go, oh, we just do it. But somebody has to do the hard work, right? People think, and that's the part they miss out on. And as far as, your second part about the AI, how can AI help with a lot of these programs? My biggest thing is I read your stuff and the data analysis, right? The data that's out there. So many times I'll get business analysts. I go, well, don't you know what the data is? Well, no. I'm like, well, why don't you know? Right? You're a business analyst. You're analyzing data. You're building this just like an AI. Can we get AI systems to analyze this data for the teams? Because one thing I noticed with everything, there's such a variety in architecture. And if you try to create a, what do you want to call it? A block or a narrowing of the gap of where people can get information, process stuff, the roadblocks, the check-ins, your rapid deployment is going to be a lot less. So maybe we can use AI to say, hey, I want to launch an AI. Just tell me all the fields I got out in this AWS or database system out there. What's the shape and thing versus have a human go out there and try to analyze thousands of tables. I've been there where they're like, there's tens of thousands of tables in here. I'm like, I know it's terrible, isn't it? But maybe, from that project perspective, getting that data, what is the customer entering? What is the customer doing? I see so many mistakes where they fail because they assume they know the customer's doing exactly what they had in their mind to do what they want to do. And I think one of your podcasts talked about having production data, right? I'm like, well, can't you analyze production data and tell me what the realm of possibilities that are out there? Well, we haven't thought about that. I'm like, why not? That's your job, stuff like that. I mean, those are the kind of things where I think AI can help those application teams understand more when they code. What are the possibilities and do some of that pre-scanning that's not done. And then they wonder why everything crashes. I had a friend of mine the other day saying, yeah, they put a wrong code in something. I'm like, you could code it so it doesn't fail because of that, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's nice with any emerging technology. It's, how can this help me do my job better.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it comes to artificial intelligence, it's, yeah, I mean, there's so many possibilities. Sometimes though, we still see people don't really know what AI can and cannot do.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't even, so either they don't know what's possible or they think that it can do more than it can. And so that's just, one challenge that we've seen. And as we had mentioned, we have a whole series about, common reasons why AI projects fail. A lot of it has to do with data also, but just even with our training at Cognilytica, and folks that listen to our podcast know that we're big advocates of doing AI right, including following the CPMAI methodology. And in that methodology, in our training, we talk about, what AI is good at and what it can do and what it can't do. And being able to understand that, I think helps to figure out how you can apply it. And I know for you on the podcast, we have defined Scrum at a high level. And now you talked about how AI can help teams and, what AI developers and folks in the field should know about Agile. But maybe what do you recommend that they understand when it comes to adopting Scrum, and how can that be useful?
I think as a group, they should go through. I mean, I must say it. If you can't invest a day or two figuring out how the methodology is going to work, don't be applying for the next 2 years. I mean, why waste your time? You're going to spend 2 years running this thing, but you can't take a day as a group, as a team, to understand the roles and kind of play that. Now, and as you're going through the class or something that's available, like you have a class, and there's tons of ways of getting this, and you can bring it in. Most Scrum Masters can probably teach Scrum to their organization. But figuring out how it will apply to what they do and modifying it then and there. But if you can't invest that little bit of time, you're not going to be happy the next 2 years,
It's a very odd thing, because we've experienced this as well, which is that sort of like the cost or time return on education learning, whether it's self-learning, it doesn't mean going to college or taking a class, even just investing time in understanding. For whatever reason, people shortcut themselves on this. Either they feel like it's not productive time, like I could be working on something instead of just sitting there and taking class. Like, but you understand that knowing how to do something actually makes what you are actually trying to do either better, more efficient. Why would you want to learn all the things that somebody already can tell you not to do or to do? And we just find it so odd that people shortcut themselves with learning and education. That's why we're trying to get in the way. Yeah, we do. Yeah, I mean, one of our biggest things is we offer education and training, especially on CPMAI, the Cognitive Project Management for AI methodology, which is this, we've been talking about it. It's an iterative approach for running AI projects. It's based on best practices, primarily focused on the steps that organizations need to follow in an iterative basis. To do things right. And we have it as a training and certification, but we know for those folks who aren't quite sure about it, they don't understand it, we do have a free intro. It's just your time. There's no other cost but your time. So, we take our free intro to CPMAI course. It's even got a little bit of some questions you can answer just for checking whether or not you have comprehension. So like our kids when they go to school, a reading comprehension check basically. Go to if you go to aitoday.live/CPMAI, so that's our little link for our podcast listeners. Go to aitoday.live/CPMAI. You can sign up for that free intro course and take it. We used to do this in webinar format, and then we found out that people are like going to the webinars at like 3:00 in the morning. So, or our Australian friends or something, they were like, yeah. So we're like, just do it on your own time, self-paced. And then, even for our own training and certification, all that is self-paced too. But like, what are you finding? I mean, are you finding like there's a knowledge gap, the education gap, is still pretty significant, even in areas like Scrum and project management that have been around for a while?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple, but I'll give you a quick example. So everyone asked me to interview Scrum Masters and Agile coaches for every place I ever work with. Hey, Greg, could you check these people out? And I'll ask them a question. I'll see they got a cert, let's say 5 years ago. I'm like, but what have you learned in the past 5 years? Have you gotten another cert? Have you learned about another mechanism? Have you learned Kanban? Have you learned XP? Have you learned SAFe? Have you learned any of this stuff? Have you learned about your program that may be in your industry? And you'd be amazed how many people don't, right? And I'm like, as a professional, even when I was in my 20s, to be honest with you, as a project manager at that point and mechanical engineer, I went to seminars. I went to learn all the time. And that's what I think a professional is, and when you do this. But I want to add one more thing. I do a little thing on building the $1 million team. And part of that is listening to all these millionaires talk about how they work, how they operate mentally. There's a Alex Hermosi, right? He sold his $100 million company, and now him and his wife are building another $100 million company. They want to make a $1 billion company. And he stresses learning. There is not one millionaire on any of these things you can listen to or pay them money for. It doesn't say, go read a book, go learn something, go get a cert, go get education. They all do it. And you wonder, why are they so rich? It's because their diversity in thought and processes and things they're learning, they're taking it and applying it back to what they do. So I'm always surprised when people don't want to do the learning. I'm like, why do you think they're millionaires or billionaires? You think they're learning and reading all the time.
You know, it's interesting. I have a second grader and they're teaching them at this young age, this idea of the growth mindset. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what you're describing, where you want to continually learn. You understand that there's things that you don't know, and you're, looking to expand your knowledge base as compared to, being closed-minded, thinking that you know everything, really being reluctant to learn more. And when you're out in the working world, I mean, in school, you see this a little bit, but when you're out in the working world, you really get all these different personalities, and you really can see, some of that reluctance. There's some politics that go on at especially at big organizations. But I think it's this idea of having that growth mindset, which is obviously what we adopt. And that's why we are, big advocates of continuing to learn and helping teach others with CPMAI and best practices methodologies. So it's nice to hear that.
And it's funny you say that. And I do a little twist. Some people think these user stories and Scrum and Agile or whatever they're doing, Kanban or any of it, has to be exactly business product. I'm like, no. Why don't you put a user story in there for growth, where everyone on the team has a story? You have a story for the whole team. Everyone takes a task and learns something new and bring it back to the team every sprint. Could you imagine if you had 10 people on a team? They all read a book, took a seminar, and then at the end of 2 weeks would share what they learned, even the Cliff Note version, how much more productive that team will be in a year? Can you imagine? You're getting 10 people that are smart people giving you that feedback. Your growth curve just skyrockets to the world. And this is also where the technology is. You should be questioning, hey, why don't we have a book reading session or a story, or change it up? Or there's a conference. Let's all go attend this conference, or let's all study some new product and bring that back to the table, right?
Exactly.
I definitely like that idea. We're big believers in that. I think, part and parcel, hopefully we're sort of, the tail end of this pandemic in terms of people not wanting to get together, because we have found that the virtual stuff is important. Hey, people listen to our podcast, they watch your videos and podcasts. Yeah. We do a lot of online training. That's all great. And it's been fantastic, honestly, to be totally honest, that, when we used to do things only in person, our audience was limited geographically. And then once you made things online, actually, for us, when we run these online events, we have our AI and government series and our enterprise AI event series. We were able to get international presenters and international audience. So it was great. But we found that people really did miss, just to share little mention about conferences and stuff, they did miss the in-person component. And there's something different about learning and sharing in person, even if it's the same material, than when you're together. And there's just a different process involved. So it's a side note to that, but yeah.
And there's a different. I had a manager years ago when I was a young person, but I ended up being chair for a bunch of things. And the manager would come in first time I attend an event. It's like, oh, we need to go to here, to here, here, here. And they would book every minute of the day of the conference for every little talk. And I'm like, wait a minute. That's not, I mean, yes, you want to see everything, but you'll learn that you're going to go one, overboard. And two, you're not going to have any chance to interact with anybody. So there's a balance. They would set that and they'd go, I'm going to go to all of them, but save some time for interaction and chatting with some people in between those conferences, right? And it's the same thing with this virtual stuff too. But even when we go back to personal, I mean, it's you got to give some space. You need that space.
Yeah. This has been such a wonderful discussion. I know that we could talk for hours with this, but I do want to be respectful of our listeners' times, listening to this podcast as well. So we do need to wrap up sadly with this discussion, but we are going to be on your podcast as well. And I'll make sure to link to that in the show notes so that
great.
our listeners can link to that. But we always end our podcast interviews with the same question, because no matter how many times we've asked it, we always get different responses. And I'm really interested to hear, from your perspective on this question as well. As a final note, what do you believe the future of AI is in general and its application to organizations and beyond?
Oh, that's a big question. I don't think there's any boundaries, to be honest with you. If you give yourself to try something and imagine it and try to go to that path. And I think some people think, where I think it's wrong would be to use AI to analyze user stories. Like what's the growth pattern? What should be the velocity? And we're going to use AI to analyze how good our people are and all that. That's not what AI should be used for. AI should be used in conjunction of building a product for the customer. How can we, there's so many ways that AI can help gather data, analyze stuff, provide some stepping stone for the team to learn from. So they can learn, in essence, from each other, right? The AI learns from us and we learn from the AI to accelerate that growth pattern even more. And that's where you need to, I think that's the future of what AI and these teams will be.
Well, great. Well, if you haven't listened to or watched the 5 a.m. Mester Scrum podcast, you definitely should. This is why we reached out to you, Greg. You're fantastic. You're knowledgeable on the subject. I think the overlap is great. And as mentioned, we're going to be on your podcast as well. So and there's a custom that you have, right? So
and there's a custom I do on my show on Fridays. There's these people I call Agile accountants, the ones that want the metrics and the fields filled out, and we got to know this. And I go, you don't even have enough spend time to figure this out. You don't even know why we're asking the question. But they give me a fortune cookie on Fridays and call it Fortune Cookie Friday. And what I do is it's double sealed wrap from these Agile accountants. They give me a message, and we have to read the fortune cookie and apply it to whatever we talked about. So I'm opening the fortune cookie, and I know it's podcast, and you can't see what I'm doing. I'm trying to make it noisy.
I can see the fortune cookie has been opened here. It was sealed.
So yeah. So now typically we can read the lucky numbers, and if anybody wins the lottery, they can donate to us any winnings from the lottery with the lucky numbers. But we'll skip that today. And so I'm going to read this, and then I'm going to ask you all to how does what is written on here apply? Person is born to live and not prepare to live.
Oh.
So based on what we talked about, a person is born to live and not prepare to live.
Well, do you want to get started, Kathleen, or should I jump in?
You can jump in first.
Yeah, it's all about, living your life is actually accomplishing and doing, right? Not just sitting around and thinking about and preparing for something that you may or may not ever do. And if we were talking about this with AI project management, and AI projects actually very applicable here, because so many people think about sort of like the possibilities. As we had that one podcast with someone's like, yeah, we have a 12 to 18 month project time frame for AI project. We're like, that's kind of crazy. I mean, it's kind of crazy. You're not actually doing AI. You're planning to do AI. You have a plan to do it, and your plan is out many, many years, but you're not actually doing it. And maybe you should, instead of, as that expression goes, the easiest way to bite an elephant is one bite at a time. Maybe instead of trying to boil that ocean, take the elephant, what can you do in a very short amount of time? What can we do in a short sprint? Scale down this project, make this much more agile, and stop planning and start doing, right, Kathleen?
Yeah, exactly. I think about this from an AI perspective, and we're, trying to figure out how the brain actually works, right? And how we learn. And so we're trying different approaches there. And so when I think about that, I'm like, oh yeah, definitely you can look at it kind of from that perspective or from these projects perspectives. We're always about think big, start small, and iterate often. So thinking with that, larger overall picture, but then iterating often and doing things in small incremental steps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And my thought on this is, we all want to live. We don't want to prepare to live like you don't want to do. So in this agile world, AI world, why not use AI to do a lot of that preparation so that we can deliver on top of that AI analysis and what we deliver? So we're always talking about automation, doing things quicker, faster, better. But if we want to know what the customer's doing so we can give them a product and all that, why don't we think about, can we use AI to do a lot of things that I do so I can free up my time to think about those new and better things that I don't have time to do right now?
Well, excellent. Well, fantastic podcast. Again, a big thank you to our host, to our guest here, Greg Mester. We're going to link to all the podcasts. We'll link to our episode as well. And just thank you so much for being a part of the show.
And I want to thank you for inviting me. This was great, and then expanded a whole nother realm of discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We always love these podcast swaps because it helps to bring in different perspectives. And I think that's incredibly important. We talked about growth mindset, and that's part of the reason why we do this, because it helps to continue to educate our listeners, educate us, and get to those different perspectives that we're not always able to bring to the table here. So again, Greg, thank you so much for joining us. And listeners, if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please make sure to rate us on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes, Google, Spotify, however you listen to us. And I also will link to some of the things that we talked about in the show notes, including the free intro course that we have for CPMAI. You can go to aitoday.live/CPMAI, but I will link to that as well. I will also link to CPMAI so you can read that as an overview. And then our podcast swap with Greg, I will make sure to link to that as well. You will not know what we talked about with our fortune cookie, so definitely chime in to figure out what fortune we got and how we answered that. And again, thank you everybody so much for listening, and we'll catch you at the next episode.